Not, then let's pursue these complaints and set up the import restrictions and do it now, not later. So, Madam President, I will not object, and I will yield back the balance of my 3 minutes that I have not used.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President, I'm thankful that the senator from North Dakota has pointed out some difference of views here, and I am really not in a position to dispute either side here. I think the amendment, as I understand it, is not objectionable to the senator from Arizona. I'm prepared to take it. I would tell the senator from North Dakota I'm going to talk to him about it, his concern about it as we go to conference. I want to tell the senator from Delaware that I'm going to look at it again. But I was not aware of those arguments that at least were put forward here. But for purposes tonight, I'm prepared to accept the amendment.
Madam President.
The senator from Missouri.
On this side, I would note for the record that Senator Packwood, the ranking member of the Finance Committee, has expressed his concerns that this is legislation within the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, but there are no other objections, to this amendment that I know of on this side.
Move.
Is all time yielded back?
Back to balance of time.
The question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
I move to reconsider it.
Move to lay that on the table.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire is recognized under the previous order.
Madam President, I send a motion to the desk and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from New Hampshire, Mr. Smith, moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 4539, to the Committee on Appropriations with instructions to report the bill to the Senate within 3 days, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with an amendment reducing the total appropriation provided therein to a sum not greater than its fiscal year 1994 level.
Madam President, I ask for the yeas and nays on my motion.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be.
Thank you, Madam President. I would say for benefit of my colleagues, I will be no more than 10 minutes or so in my remarks, and unless I'm engaged by some on the other side, it should be about the time there would be a recorded vote. President Reagan used to have an expression where he said, "Here we go again." And here we go again. We just rejected an opportunity to save $405 million on this appropriations bill, taking 5,000 IRS agents out of the IRS who hassle the taxpayers of America. That was rejected with a vote of something like 54 or 55 to 43. So there's not a great deal of optimism that I have that my amendment will not meet the same fate, Madam President, but I believe that history will judge us in the way we conduct ourselves here, and I think history is going to judge that the neglect that we have provided to the national debt and the deficits that keep adding to that debt in this country, I think history is going to judge that we were very seriously wrong and that we passed a huge debt on to our children, and that that's wrong, and that the only one of the ways that we can deal with this specifically when they come to the floor of the United States Senate are the appropriation bills. Now, I offered an amendment to recommit the legislative appropriations bill last week, and it was defeated by a voice vote with very few people here to really care one way or the other. That would have saved $93 million. I just watched Senator Grassley's amendment go down, which would have saved $405 million. A million here, a million there, as Senator Dirksen used to say from your state of Illinois. Soon it adds up to real money. Now it's $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there. So the bottom line is nobody should be fooled. The United States Senate is not interested in saving money and saving the taxpayers' money, because if they were, they would not be rejecting amendments like this, number one, like the Grassley amendment. Number two, they would not be increasing the appropriation bills as they come before us on the Senate floor. You cannot reduce spending if you increase appropriation bills. That's really not all that complicated to understand, but that's what we're doing. Now, let's look at the one before us. The bill, the amount of the bill that's been sent up here today is $23,573,863,000. The amount enacted in fiscal 94 was $22,538,822,000. Now, where I took math, the difference is $1,035,041,000. That's how much we're spending over last year's bill. That's what's before us today. Senator Grassley did try to get $405 million of it, and he failed. But we are spending over $1 billion more than we spent last year in this appropriation. So when you go back home to your constituents and you tell them you want to cut spending and you favor reducing the spending of the United States government, I hope you're going to also be able to tell them you voted for this amendment, because it's pretty difficult to justify saying you want to cut spending if you're not willing to. I'm not even asking you to cut spending. I'm asking you to come in at last year's level. I'm asking you to cut the increase of $1 billion. $1 billion. I said it last week on this floor, and I'm going to say it again this week, and again next week, and the following week, and every week, that an appropriations bill comes on the floor of the United States Senate that's more money than it was last year, because it's wrong. We hear all kinds of reasons. There's always a reason, all kinds of justifications. But these increases are simply unacceptable. They are unacceptable when we go out and face our constituents and hear the hardships that they're having, trying to meet their tax requirements every day of their lives. And here we are increasing spending. Talk to your constituents and they'll tell you they want the government to cut spending. They want it to reduce spending. But no, we're not only not reducing it, we can't even come in at last year's level. That's all I'm asking. This is not a cut. It's a reduction of the increase. Question is, why should we spend more money than we did last year? Why? We have a $4.5 trillion national debt. The deficit will run at least $170 billion this year. Here's our chance to take one paltry billion, one little billion. It's a lot of money, but it's really quite little compared to $4.5 trillion, isn't it? The $1 billion increase, and this is very important, because a lot of people think we just reach up, pull the money down off the tree, and spend it. I mean, after all, this is a $23 billion appropriation bill we're talking about here. This $1 billion increase in this legislation is borrowed money, my colleagues. We borrowed this money. We don't have a surplus in the Treasury. There's no surplus there. So we can't reach up there, take $1 billion and say, okay, we're going to add it to this, the appropriation last year and spend it on all these worthwhile causes. No, we're not doing that. We're borrowing that billion. Now, when you borrow at roughly 7% interest, $1 billion, that's an additional $70 million in interest costs alone on this billion. Not on this bill, this billion. $70 million in interest. So we're spending borrowed dollars. Spending borrowed dollars. When we ought to be finding ways to offset so we don't have to borrow more and pass this debt on to our kids. You realize how selfish we are, how selfish and inconsiderate we are, passing on this kind of monumental debt to our kids. That's what we're doing. And everybody stands up here on the floor and says, oh, this is a great cause. We need to have this money. We can't, if we don't have this $1 billion increase, the whole government's going to fold up. My goodness, I'm sure the whole government will just close down. We have to have this $1 billion increase. We can't live without it. We couldn't possibly live on what we had last year. Well, let me tell you something, Madam President. There are millions of families out there that are living on what they had last year, and millions of families out there that are trying to live on less than they had last year. And I don't understand why we can't set the example in the United States Senate. Madam President, could I have water in the chamber, please? The OMB estimates that the federal government will spend more than $1.5 trillion in the upcoming fiscal year. The breakdown is not very complicated. It's easy to figure. Mandatory entitlement spending will consume about $775 billion of that. Net interest on the debt, an item that's difficult to reduce unless you reduce spending, will total approximately $213 billion in fiscal year 1995. Interest on the debt in 1995, fiscal 1995, will be $213 billion. Very soon, not too many years, maybe by the end of the decade, interest on the debt is going to pass defense spending in the budget of the United States of America. That's a pretty sad commentary. Defense spending now is roughly $270 billion, and the lines are coming, and they're going to cross, and interest is going to go this way, and defense is going to go this way. We're going to spend in this budget, overall budget, about $18 billion on international affairs, and last but no means least, we're going to spend $270 billion in the domestic discretionary category. Total spending, $1.52 trillion with a T. Total revenue, $1.34 trillion. Total deficit, $171 billion. This takes $1 billion off of that deficit. Not only does it do that, it takes $70 million in additional interest expense. You know what this will mean? Ultimately, if we don't stop this insanity, total bankruptcy for the United States of America. I have mixed emotions about being here, either as an observer somewhere out in the hills of New Hampshire, or perhaps here on the Senate floor, watching those who year after year, day after day, month after month, continue to increase this spending. I want to hear what they have to say to their constituents and to the American people when the country goes bankrupt, when we don't have any money in the Social Security Trust Fund, or Medicare, or Medicaid, or the defense of America. What are you going to say then? When are we going to stop it? Our spending addiction has got to end sooner rather than later, I hope. I know that our spending program is not isolated in this area. To the credit of those who are the manager of this bill, I realize that. Certainly not their fault that we have a $4.5 trillion national debt. However, we have an opportunity to make a small dent in it, but instead we're going to increase it. The only opportunity we have is to deal with the 13 appropriations bills as they come down and to reform entitlements. Those are the only two things really we can do, because until we reduce the debt, we can't reduce the interest payments on the debt. So already, between the legislative branch bill considered last week and the bill before the Senate today, Congress is spending $1.1 billion more than we did last year. $1 billion, a little over $1 billion today, and $93 million on Thursday. So about $1.1 billion, a little over. That's what we've added. That's what we're adding to the debt, to the deficit, just with these two votes. It'll be interesting, Madam President. I can't wait to see the result. It'll be interesting to see how many people step up and say, you know, maybe we could afford to take one little paltry $1 billion out of a $1.5 trillion budget. It'll be interesting to see how many votes we get. I predict 30 to 35 max. We'll see. What signal does this send the American people? I would ask my colleagues, what signal does it send the American people when we do this? Time after time after time. If we can't make little reductions like this, How do you expect to ever get into entitlement reform? How do you ever expect to pay off, let alone begin to pay off? How in the world will you ever expect to pay off a $4.5 trillion national debt? Believe me, the archaeologists are going to be digging up our graves by the time that's paid off and wondering what in the world we did during this era of time. When I hold town meetings in New Hampshire to discuss the deficit and talk about the need for entitlement reform, frankly, many of my constituents, some of them Social Security recipients, some of them on Medicare, even Medicaid, say to me, we're willing to help. We might be willing to have our entitlements frozen, but I don't want to read about waste. If you're going to take my COLA or cut my COLA or reduce my COLA, I don't want to read about you wasting billions of dollars in some pork project that some particular senator or congressman decided that they wanted to put into some appropriations bill without an authorization. I don't want to read about that. I don't want to read about waste. And they're right. They shouldn't. But if they read these reports on these appropriations bills, they're going to find bad news in there. Bad news. When are we going to stop? I care about my country. I care about my country very much. And I'm really sad to see my colleagues passing time after time after time spending increases, not willing to make those tough decisions. This one isn't all that tough. But the tough decisions, not willing to make them, and passing on this debt. The equivalent of this is you're leaving your mortgage payments to your children rather than your home. That's what we're doing. Most of us would prefer to leave our home, our assets, not our liabilities, to our children. Why do we, in this body, in the Congress of the United States Senate, feel that it's right to pass on a debt of $4.5 trillion to our children? And I wish it stopped there. It does not stop at $4.5 trillion. It is growing at approximately $175 billion a year being added on to that debt, and that is going to go up even more dramatically after the turn of the century to approximately $350 billion a year. All of that money being added to the debt to where you get up to the year 2010 or so, and you're going to be looking at a $6 or $7 trillion national debt, maybe higher, and at which point we will not be able to recover. Take a $10 trillion national debt, for example. 7% of that is $700 billion a year in interest. That's what that would be when we get to that point. Now, how do we stop it? If we don't cut spending, if we don't balance the budget, we already rejected a balanced budget amendment here. We've rejected numerous requests for fiscal restraint and responsibility in here. We always say we don't need it. I heard it said on the floor of the Senate by many of my colleagues, some been here a lot longer than I have. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. We just have to exercise fiscal restraint. Well, I hope those who were making that argument will come out here now and say, here, I'm going to exercise fiscal restraint. It's time. You're right, Senator Smith. I did say that, and here's my vote for your amendment. We'll take this $1 billion. Wouldn't it be nice? I think we'd surprise the American people. Well, I can say one thing. A lot of my colleagues are going to be surprised in November if we don't start exercising fiscal restraint, because that's what the American people want. They don't want debt passed on to their children. You know, I'm amazed. I used to serve on a local school board. And I'll tell you, there is no way that the constituents that I represented would allow me, as the chairman of that school board, to come out and say, folks, we're going to deficit spend. We don't have enough money, so we're going to have to borrow red ink and deficit spend. No way. It wouldn't work. They'd come to me and they'd say, and they did, cut spending. Somewhere, I don't care where you cut, you're the board members, cut it. Well, we want the budget balanced. And that's what the American people want us to do in this place. But at the federal government level, we don't do it. So, let me just say this, Madam President, in conclusion. There's always a condition. There's always a reason why we should increase spending. And I'm sure we'll probably hear some before the debate is over. But it's not good enough. This Congress is not accepting the challenge. This is a major challenge. This is America at stake, the fiscal responsibility of this country. And if we don't start with one little area of an appropriation bill, I'm not asking you to cut it by 10%, 20%, even 1%. I'm asking you to come in at last year's level. Spend what you spent last year. Make do with what you had last year. Show the way on one appropriations bill. That's all I ask. Instead, we've already considered two, and when this one is over, and each has proposed to spend more money than we did last year. So again, if this amendment is defeated, and I believe that it will be, we will have a $1.1 billion increase to our deficit, which in turn will be added to the debt. The word austerity does not leap to mind when I think of the United States Senate, Madam President. I'm offering my colleagues a very simple choice. There isn't anything complicated about it. Nothing complicated about this one. You want to cut spending? You vote for the Smith Amendment, or the motion to recommit. That's what I'm asking. Let me point out, if you don't want to cut it, then you don't. But let me point out, this is a motion to recommit. It gives the committee the full flexibility, the Appropriations Committee. I'm not going across the board with cuts. I'm not singling out any program. I'm simply asking the committee to come back in where they feel they want to do it, wherever they want to do it. They're the experts. They're in there. Come back with what we spent last year. That's what this motion to recommit does. And again, cut is the wrong word. Freeze is the right word. So you either want to freeze spending or you don't, not cut spending. Should federal spending on the Treasury, Postal Service, other independent agencies be increased from last year's levels, or should it be decreased? Or do we owe the American people at the very minimum our vote to hold the line on spending? I think we owe them a vote to hold the line on spending. A very minimal line, I might say. Madam President, in closing, let me just repeat. My motion is to recommit the bill to the Appropriations Committee with instructions that they report a bill that does not exceed last year's spending levels. They have the full flexibility to do it, and if they do that, we will save $1 billion plus on this vote alone in the United States Senate. I yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam President. My friend from New Hampshire is correct. Madam President.
The Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Madam President. My friend from New Hampshire is correct. This bill is indeed $1.116 billion above the FY 1994 enacted levels. There are increases in these appropriations bill. But I would note that the committee has already reduced the President's request by $794 million. Now, what may escape the attention of some of my colleagues is the fact that mandatory increases which authorizing committees, not the Appropriation Committee, have jurisdiction over, total $709 million above the FY 1994 level. My colleague made some comments about dealing with entitlements and mandated spending. I look forward to joining him to work on those, because anybody who looks at the spiral in spending by the federal government realizes they come from directed spending programs, not programs subject to discretionary appropriations. There is another measure in this bill, the $405 million, which is above the budget request. That was just approved on a 54-43 vote. Now, my colleague says that this is additional spending. He is concerned, as I am, about the national debt. This $405 million compliance initiative over 5 years will raise a net of $7 billion to go to reducing the debt. if he is concerned, as I am, about the size of the debt and our inability to reduce that debt, then I would assume that he must have voted for that compliance initiative. Because when you have only 83% of the taxes owed actually being paid, those of us who are complying voluntarily are carrying the load of the 17% who are not. And we are seeing voluntary compliance go down because there is not sufficient credibility that people who do not comply voluntarily will be pursued. If you take out the mandatory $709 million above the 94 level and the $405 million that we just approved by a specific vote to lower the debt by $7 billion over 5 years, the new funding, discretionary funding added on in this bill would be less than $2 million above the FY 1994 level. Now, this committee cannot reduce the mandatory accounts. So to take the bill back to the 1994 levels, there would have to be an across-the-board reduction of approximately 10%. There are very few programs in the bill, so most of the money goes for salaries and operating expenses of agencies. Reductions would, in fact, cause management problems for all agencies. But let me tell you specifically what it would do, and I think it is probably an inadvertent impact of the motion that my colleague from New Hampshire has made, and that would be to cripple the war on drugs and crime by making deep cuts in drug-related law enforcement. One of the things that we have been able to do in this bill is to restore cuts in law enforcement made by the Clinton administration, set up by the Office of Management and Budget. These are the cuts that would be, these are the additions that would be most at risk were this motion to be adopted. We were able to restore 110 customs agents inspectors, 10 positions for pilots and crew, $8.8 million to enhance air operations, $20 million from the Drug Czar Forfeiture Fund for air and marine operations, 71 positions as Secret Service agents for counterfeiting and entitlement fraud investigations, 22 positions for ATF agents specializing in enforcement activities, 7 positions in federal law enforcement training efforts, 2 positions for financial investigations in the Finn Center. Well, I am very proud, Mr. President, to have played a role in restoring these cuts because I believe these positions are vital. The federal government must continue aggressively and offensively to fight the war on drugs. A week or two ago, I met with chiefs of police, prosecutors, and federal law enforcement officials to discuss what they believe will and will not work fighting crime on the streets. In real life, this group represented law enforcement officials with a wide range of experience from the inner city of St. Louis to the most outlying suburb. In this meeting, the crime fighters all agreed that only with strong support from the federal government can the drug war be won. Yet the Clinton administration proposed to slash the Drug Czar's office by 84%, the State Department's International Narcotics Matters budget by 32% over the last 2 years, and in this year's budget proposal, the administration sought to eliminate drug enforcement grants completely. Now, in my state, law enforcement officials urge that there is a need for a comprehensive approach to fighting the drug war, a comprehensive approach that includes money for treatment, but which also makes funding for interdiction an integral part in combating drugs. Only the federal government has the resources and the jurisdictional authority to interdict drugs at our borders. It is a vicious, insidious, horrific chain. If we allow more drugs to leak into the United States, then more drugs end up in our neighborhoods, more crimes are committed by those using and selling drugs, more crimes are committed to get drugs, more crimes are committed under the influence of drugs, and tragically, more people become drug addicted and need treatment. We need to weaken this chain of crime and devastation at every link, not strengthening it by ignoring interdiction or by forcing cuts in this appropriations bill that will take money from drug interdiction efforts. Local authorities depend upon drug enforcement grants to state and local governments to fund multi-jurisdictional drug teams, street-level enforcement teams that shut down neighborhood drug dens, drug crime laboratories that share technology and expertise with local officials, and treatment for drug offenders. At least one Missouri law enforcement officials told us that the worst thing that we could do on drug law enforcement was to cut the grant money from the Regional Information Sharing System and the Burns grant money. Once again, in my meetings with local law enforcement officials, one theme continues to surface. The state and local law enforcement officials that I met with in southeast Missouri attributed much of the alarming rise in crime, both violent and nonviolent, to the distribution, use, and addiction to illegal drugs. Furthermore, state and local law enforcement officials have stressed that in light of manpower limits and budget constraints on training and equipment, it's vital that there be federal law enforcement entities with whom they can work cooperatively. One officer from a very small town, Marble Hill, Missouri, told me, quote, "When we become involved in a major crime or investigation, it's a comfort to know that the federally funded agencies such as DEA, FBI, ATF, federal marshals, and the National Guard are there for much-needed help and resources. These agencies are very critical in the outcome of having adequate law enforcement here. When their budgets are being cut and decreased, our means and ways of getting outside help and assistance are also cut and decreased," close quotes. Now, Mr. President, I cite that as an example of the degree to which state and local law enforcement officials depend upon federal drug assistance, federal drug law enforcement assistance. And frankly, to recommit this bill to freeze it would put at risk, obviously, not all of those drug enforcement activities, but the Customs Agency inspectors, the air operations, the drug czar, the Secret Service agents, the ATF agents, the people who are providing a vital link and a vital resource in fighting crime that devastates our states, our communities, our neighborhoods. Mr. President, we need to get our debt and our deficit under control. Trying to nickel and dime law enforcement, which would be the most likely outcome of this measure, is not the way to do it. If we're to avoid seeing the deficit skyrocket, we have to be able to collect the taxes. IRS does that. We also need to have the resources to help local law enforcement officials combat drug activities in this state and to interdict drugs coming in from across our borders. Mr. President, I hope that my colleagues will not support the motion to recommit.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Hampshire.
I don't wish to prolong this much longer, but I do want to respond to one point, a couple of points that the senator from Missouri made. First of all, the motion should be fully understood. I thought I made it clear. The motion to recommit does not tell the senator from Missouri or the senator from Arizona to cut any specific program. It doesn't say where he should cut. It doesn't say you don't have to cut anything. All we're asking in the motion is that the Appropriations Committee find dollars wherever they see fit to bring the budget in line with what it was last year. That's what it says. Don't read more into the motion than what it is. I didn't say cut law enforcement. I didn't say cut drug enforcement. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I agree with the senator on those points. So I would also point out that just the previous vote, we had an opportunity to take $405 million of the $1 billion that I'm looking for from IRS agents. I don't know what that has to do with drugs, but that's a fact. We rejected that. So it's a very weak argument. I also want to say that I've been in the Congress of the United States for 10 years. Not as long as many of my colleagues, but I've been here for 10 years, and I've heard the argument every single debate that we have on any matter to cut spending. I hear the same argument over and over and over again. If we would just spend this money, we're going to save all this money, and we're going to have tremendous savings. Well, it would seem to me that by now we ought to have a balanced budget if that's the case. If we're going to spend all this money to make money, then we ought to have a balanced budget. But it isn't working that way, folks. It's going the reverse. In the last 10 years, the debt has tripled. It hasn't gone down, it's gone up. So it's not working. Somebody better get the message. Spending money to make money isn't working, folks. It's time to cut spending. That'll work. I guarantee you that'll work. If you don't have it, you can't spend it. Now, my colleague from North Carolina, and I want to close on this point, spoke on the floor yesterday, and I think just a small portion of what he said is worth repeating because it goes right to the heart of this entire debate, in case somebody missed it. Senator Helms said as of Friday, on June 17th, at the close of business, the federal debt, down to the penny, stood at $4,591,908,053,316.92. That was as of Friday. It's a lot more now. Several days have passed. But this debt was run up by the Congress of the United States of America. You can't blame anybody else. There's nobody else you can blame. You can't blame any president, Democrat or Republican. Can't blame President Reagan or President Clinton because we appropriate every dime. That's exactly what Senator Helms, that's the point that he makes. The U.S. Constitution is quite specific about that, Senator Helms says, as every schoolboy is supposed to know. Now, Senator Helms goes on to say, most people cannot conceive of $1 billion of anything, let alone $1 trillion. Let's get some idea what $1 billion and $1 trillion means in another picture here. This is what Senator Helms says. It may provide a bit of perspective to bear in mind that 1 billion seconds ago, the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on. 1 billion minutes ago, not many years had elapsed since the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That sort of puts it in perspective, doesn't it? That Congress has run up a federal debt of 4.5 of those billions of dollars. In other words, the federal debt, as I said earlier, stands today at $4,591,000,000,000, etc. Those words are very accurate. And frankly, they are very indicative of what the problem is in this place. Again, I heard it just seconds ago from my colleague from Missouri. We've got to cut the debt. We've got to cut spending. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to do it. In your household, if you can't make ends meet, you cut somewhere. If your car breaks down and you want to go on vacation, you cancel the vacation. We don't cancel anything around here. We just borrow more money over and over again. You'd think I was asking for us to cut $25 trillion out of the debt budget or something. I'm asking for $1 billion to come back to last year's level. I'm not cutting a nickel. And the other argument that was used, well, the president's budget, I don't care what the president's budget is. If the president's budget's over, we should deal with our own budget in here. We can work the president's budget into our debate, but whatever the president sends in is not relevant. The question is, what did we spend last year? Are we spending more than last year? And the answer is yes. Over $1 billion more than last year on this one appropriations bill. You can't reduce spending if you don't vote to do it. There's nothing complicated about that. So bear in mind, as you evaluate those who vote, as the citizens of America evaluate those who vote on this amendment, take a look at those votes on this amendment. And the next time somebody who votes against it says to you out there that I support cutting spending, where were you on this vote? It isn't cutting spending even. It's freezing it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Arizona. Mr. President, the freeze amendment offered by the senator from New Hampshire is, first of all, let me say that I understand where he's coming from because we all talk about cutting the deficit here, but I think the senator probably will agree that the biggest problem of not cutting the deficit here, no matter what we do budget resolutions, even when we adopted the president's economic plan that did cut the deficit, we can't really get at the deficit until we do something about entitlements. Now, the facts for whoever is listening here, they want to know it, is that this bill is, as the Senator said, over $1 billion, slightly, $1,115,000,000, as I see it, $497,000 above last year's level. Now, $406 million, or $405 million, we just voted on. We know what that is, clear. And the Senate said, we're not going to cut that out because we want to go after those taxpayers who haven't been paying, and that, I think, is set beside us. So now where's the rest of that increase? Well, the rest of that increase, some $708,674,000, are mandatory expenses. That's right, you got it, entitlements. Things that we can't cut here. We don't have the jurisdiction, and we're not, the Senator's amendment, though it applies across the whole board, is not going to reduce the mandatories. And what are these mandatories? Well, they're the civil service retirement, something we have to enact by law. The money has to go. They're the health, life insurance, and disability payments, something that we have to enact. Now, having said that, we are in this bill $329,780,000 below the President's request. Now that is it. No, excuse me. We're $793 million below the President's request. So we have made cuts here. Now there is increases over last year's, and the mandatories take up the bulk of that, and then you add the enhancement, which we just voted on, and there you have it. So now what are you going to do? I don't see any amendments here to go after the civil service retirement, but that's what you have to do if you really want to cut across the board, and we're just not doing it. We can't reduce these mandatory accounts. Those funds have to be paid out, and they're going to come out. So what's left? If this amendment passes, we go back, and what do we cut? Well, the senator from New Hampshire says, well, you don't have to cut the National Drug Control Policy Special Forfeiture Fund. You don't have to cut customs. You don't have to cut IRS criminal investigations. You don't have to cut the internal, ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. You don't have to cut the Secret Service that not only protect the president but do fraud cases. You don't have to cut these things. You make up your mind. Well, I'm telling the senator we have no choice to do except what the senator from Missouri has indicated. We will cut the drug program. That's what's going to get cut here, because we can't cut the mandatory programs. And so the senator puts us in the worst of positions, that we have to go and cut customs, the air interdiction program, the marine interdiction program, the effort, and that's already cut over last year by some 26 or 24 million dollars. That's below last year's level. And I can go through program by program and point out where we made cuts. And it gets back to the reason we're increased at all here is because of the compliance initiative and the mandatories. So to me, this would not be a fair amendment and really be a freeze. Because if you don't do entitlements and you have decided that you're going to do the compliance initiative, we're at a freeze. Actually, we're below the president's request because we made some cuts. But we didn't make it in law enforcement. We didn't make it in the drug interdiction program. So I hope at the appropriate time, when this senator moves to table this amendment, that the Senate will go on record that we have a freeze here. And until there is somebody who wants to stand up and take on the entitlements, this is just a game. And we are not spending more from the standpoint of the discretionary part of this bill. And we have made cuts, and I can go through them item by item. The Department office and the Treasury office is $3 million reduction. The United States Customs, we cut some there. in order to get back to some of the law enforcement. Salaries and expenses, we cut $13 million. Internal revenue, we even made reductions there, trying to get below, because we knew we'd have this question on the initiative. And we cut $69 million out of the administration and management account. So I just want to, we cut $1,191,000 out of OMB. We asked them to take a bite. The construction account, the president requested $999 million. We cut it. Now the senator wants to make it real easy. If you're for deficit reduction, just vote this, because here it is. Well, I'm for deficit reduction, and I produced a bill here with the senator from Missouri and the entire Appropriations Committee that does stay within the caps, funds the mandatories, and makes a substantial reduction of $793 million below what the president requested.
I apologize, my colleague from Colorado. I'll be very brief. The senator from Arizona, again, makes the case that somehow I'm cutting these programs. I'm not asking you to cut those programs. I'm asking you to look at the area that you have responsibility for and make cuts where you see fit. You saw fit to add $405 million after making those cuts for 5,000 more IRS agents. So I find the senator's argument very difficult to comprehend. I mean, it's nice to go to the town meetings and you can say that the Smith Amendment, I didn't vote for it because it was going to cut crime or it was going to cut drug enforcement. The truth of the matter, it doesn't do either.
But would the senator yield?
The senator knows that.
Would the senator yield?
Yes.
Where would the senator cut it then? If he were on this committee...
I'd take $405 million. I'd take half of it from the IRS agents.
Well, I appreciate that. You already voted on that, but that was turned down. And I assume
that's correct.
Okay, now where else would you cut it?
Well, if...
where else would you cut it?
I'm directing you.
That's right.
I'm directing
I'm telling you what we would have to do to get that additional $708 million. We'd have to cut law enforcement and the drug interdiction program.
The point is, if the Senate of the United States feels that that's what you should do, as the chairman of that committee, that's what you'd be directed to do with this motion to recommit. The truth of the matter is, the Senate will do that only if they want to reduce spending. And I would just say, and not to belabor the point, but for the senator to stand on the floor of the Senate and say that somehow we have to deal with entitlements if we're going to get a handle on the budget deficit and the debt, I totally agree with you. But if we're not willing to cut to freeze $1 billion increase in one appropriations bill, how in the world are we going to have the courage to go out and face entitlement reform? It's the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard. We cannot, if we're not willing to do that with $1 billion in freeze, how in the world are we going to face up to entitlements? The point is, nobody faces up to anything. You have to take one step before you walk a mile. And nobody wants to take the first step. That's the bottom line.
Does the senator yield?
I'm just, yes, I will yield. Yes.
You know, I just want to point out that, you know, if the senator wants to be really constructive here, I would welcome him suggesting where he would cut. We already know the 405, we voted that out, so that's not going to happen. So where else would he cut out of that discretionary area?
Well, I would say to the senator...
Lay out $700 million of cuts, and I dare say you won't be able to not cut into the drug program, not cut into the drug czar, not cut into the customs drug program or the commercial trade program, or not cut into the ATF or the Secret Service. I know the bill pretty well. I think the senator from New Mexico, who used to be the ranking member, would agree that it's hard to find that money when if you're told to go back and cut $1 billion out of those areas and not cut the drug and the crime-related areas here.
I would say to the senator, again, we're not cutting $1 billion. We're coming in at last year's level. You are increasing last year's level $1 billion. We're not cutting anybody. We're cutting only because you've increased it with what you've brought up here, including $405 million. That's the point that I want to make. And I would say to the senator, if you vote for and this amendment passes, this motion to recommit, I'll work with you in areas to cut other than drug and law enforcement. But I just want to ask unanimous consent to add as co-sponsors Senators Brown, Roth, and Faircloth.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the Smith Amendment, and
have co-sponsored this not out of a way of condemning the work of the Appropriation Committee or the distinguished subcommittee chairman that has brought this measure before us. As a matter of fact, he's pointed out, the senator from Arizona has pointed out that this is within the budget guidelines, that it is less than what the President asked for. I believe both those statements are accurate, and he's to be commended for having made that progress. The reality is that our history in the last 15 years is that Congress has consistently overspent its own budget, not only the President's budget, but its own budget. So to have fit this measure within the budget as clearly has been done, I think is something that he's to be proud of, not ashamed. But I rise in support of that amendment out of an additional concern. What we spent is not simply a function of what we would like to spend in each area, but it's a function of what we have. Senator Smith has pointed out the awesome size of the national debt. I would draw members' attention to another item. Included in the President's budget package that he sent to Congress, and frankly included in President Bush's last budget message, was a reference to generational accounting. That generational accounting has a very interesting calculation. Included in that is an effort to estimate what someone born today would have to pay in the way of taxes simply to pay for the programs that are already in existence. This assumes not overspending the budget by a penny. It assumes no new programs. It assumes that our estimates, economic estimates, are valid. I think members of this body and American citizens will note none of those things have happened. In other words, we have in the last 15 years always overspent our budget. We have always had over-optimistic economic assumptions, at least on the average they've been overly optimistic. And you've also seen crises declared which end up overdoing it. And we've every year added new programs. But even assuming we don't add any new programs, that our economic assumptions are sound, and that we don't overspend the budget, even assuming all of that, President Clinton's own budget estimated that someone born today would pay 82% of everything they earned in their lifetime in terms of taxes. 82%. Simply for the programs that are already on the books. Now that includes local, state, and federal all combined. But part of our decisions as to what we spend has to include not only what we'd like to appropriate, but has to include our ability to appropriate, has to include our ability to continue to pay these budgets. It seems to me, the senator from New Hampshire's proposal is a modest one. He's not talking about cuts. He's talking about simply staying within the amount that was appropriated the prior year. I believe we can do it. I have faith in the Appropriations Committee to go back and set priorities. Is it going to be easy? No. But I think it can, and frankly, Mr. President, I think it must be done. If our children are to have a future, if we're going to be an economically viable entity in the world markets, if we're going to be competitive, the cost of government has to be brought under control. It seems to me that Senator Smith has brought to us a valid, workable alternative, one that utilizes the good knowledge of the committee to set priorities. I certainly think the senator from Arizona's question as to where specifically he would find the funds is an appropriate question. It's a fair question. Members may recall that Senator Kerry and I brought to this floor during the budget consideration a proposal that would have specifically delineated almost $100 billion in cuts over the next 5 years. We named specific programs in specific areas. Frankly, I don't know that the fact that it was specific necessarily helped. The history of this Congress is that we seem to turn down the efforts to cut spending or control spending, whether they're specific or not. Is it fair to ask where you would specifically get the money? Yes, absolutely. It's fair. But ultimately, we have to wean ourselves from ever-increasing deficits. It seems to me that clearly the senator from New Hampshire's amendment does that. The senator from New Hampshire's amendment does say, at least for 1 year, we're not going to increase spending in this area. It's the kind of thing that I think that merits approval here And frankly, I think it's the kind of amendment that I hope he offers or others offer on other appropriation bills that come before the floor. We can turn this around, but we can only turn it around if we're willing to back solid, courageous amendments such as the one that's been brought forward by the senator from New Hampshire. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
President,
Senator from North Carolina.
I rise to send to the desk an amendment, and I ask for its immediate consideration.
Is that in order? Is the senator from North Carolina attempting to amend the motion to recommit?
No.
The motion to recommit is the pending business. It would take unanimous consent in order to amend it at this time.
All right, I'll withhold for now then.
Senator withholds. Who seeks recognition? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
First, I would ask the senator if he would withhold on that request.
Senator withholds. Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, might I ask the manager and the proponent of the motion to instruct how much longer do we think we will be before there's something decisive on this amendment?
Speaking on this side, there's no more debate on this side that I'm aware of.
Mr. President, to answer the senator's question, not more than 3 minutes here. We're ready to go to a vote, although we won't have a vote until sometime around 7. So we will put it off or lay it aside and go to another amendment.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Mexico.
I would ask that I be permitted to proceed for 5 minutes as of the morning business.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, the manager of this bill on the majority side, Senator Dennis DeConcini, comes from the West, just like I do. And I arrived here 22 years ago. I have a funny-sounding name. It also ends in I, like Senator DeConcini's. This Senate, for all of its history, had only one Italian-American senator, John Pastore, Democrat from Rhode Island, until the Senate was shocked to find that there were actually Italian-American Republicans in the West. But I arrived, and I was the first Italian-American senator to ever serve as a Republican. It wasn't too long afterwards that our neighboring state, and actually we used to be one before we separated and became states and joined the Union, wasn't too long thereafter until another arrived from the West, and his name was Dennis DeConcini. Now, frankly, neither he nor I think our names are very similar, but somehow there are many people who think we were one and the same. In fact, we joked many times about getting each other's mail and even people stopping us in various places around the country. And interestingly enough, as I recall, you helped President Carter and voted for the Panama Canal Treaty with a reservation that you proposed. And I didn't. And that was a pretty heavy issue out there among conservatives. And frankly, I was stopped in many a place shortly after that, and I was accosted as being one who voted for the Panama Canal Treaty, and I wondered what they were talking about. And I soon found that in some instances our names were being confused, and it didn't all make too much sense. But frankly, I was never embarrassed to be confused with Dennis DeConcini, and I hope the same is true for him. In addition, I can remember one time, because of certain positions the good senator from Arizona had taken regarding organized crime, that there was kind of a note around, sort of a rumble, that his life had been threatened. And I remember joking to him, saying, is the threat over with? I hope so, so they won't be confusing us. And we had a good laugh about that. But seriously, I rise tonight to say thanks to my good friend, not because of where our ancestors came from, but because I think he's been a very, very good senator. And regardless of what's happened and the reason that he has decided not to run, I wanted him to know and the Senate to know that this is one senator who knows him very, very well because I worked with him. I had this particular position of the ranking member on this subcommittee for a long time. And I can tell you, there's no harder working person around. Secondly, there's no senator in this place or in modern times that is more concerned about the law enforcement man on the beat. He had more concern for the Border Patrol, the FBI, the DEA than any senator here. And he did more early on when crime was not the issue of the day than anybody here. And I believe as he leaves us, it's time for somebody from this side of the aisle to say that about somebody from that side of the aisle. And I say it very willingly and very openly. Now, I could go through some things that this small bill, it doesn't have a lot of jurisdiction, that was done on this bill to help the relationship between the United States and Mexico, and a big precursor to the NAFTA and free trade agreement. You know, Mr. President, fellow senators, it was not a president of the United States, nor any of his cabinet people, nor his Border Patrol director, any of those that came to the Congress and said the border between Mexico and America, as it pertains to our facilities, border crossings, with jails attendant, with restrooms that are there, with facilities that are there. Nobody came forth from the executive branch saying that's a disgrace, a disaster. It really isn't befitting the United States to have such deplorable border facilities. It was Senator DeConcini. And believe it or not, in a Treasury postal bill, the first signs of a master plan for making the border facilities modern between our two great nations came from this little subcommittee under the leadership of that senator from the state of Arizona. A $357 million program to rebuild facilities that were broken down, that were absolute disgraces. I had one in my state that essentially, if either OSHA or the Environmental Protection Agency or any regulatory agency for the United States went and looked at it, they'd have closed it down. It was a disaster in terms of how it treated people. The jail facilities federal judges would have let people out of there the minute they arrived if they knew about them. Nothing at all modern about the scales and the weighing system and how you stop people and check. And there's a brand spanking new facility there, as there are many places up and down that border, which, as I said, are necessary infrastructure precursors to a NAFTA and an increase of trade between our two countries. So that's one that I choose to mention here tonight, because in a very real way it shows a lot of things. It shows he knows the problems of his state and expands that quickly to the national problem. And secondly, he's got a great deal of tenacity. I mean, he won't give up. And there are some around here who I'm sure don't like that tenacity because they wish he would have given up from time to time around here. But he didn't give up when it came to finding a way to put that kind of program into place and into being, even if it was in an appropriation bill. I think he remembers that. And let me also say, the battles that are here on the floor today, they never seem to disappear. How many Internal Revenue agents are enough? Revenue foregone has been an issue forever. At least it's finally getting resolved in terms of how does the post office handle the charitable kinds of mailings that are coming in at less than the full price, and who pays for that? And the Congress is never willing to face up to that year after year, sticking this little committee with that problem as if all of a sudden we could write laws to change that. But with his tenacity and hard work, that one's gotten solved, or at least mostly solved, with reference to the future of reduced rate mailings for the Red Cross and the Boy Scouts and the Organization for the Blind and the like. So, Mr. President, I don't pass judgment on the amendment that's before us, but I do pass judgment tonight for myself personally and my family. And we say thank you, Arizona, for sending Senator DeConcini here. It's been a pleasure to be his working partner and to find so many areas and we could work together in behalf of our states and our country. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Arizona.
I thank my friend from New Mexico, and indeed he is a friend, and we have had some laughs about our names being so similar, but